Hello, thank you for joining me. My name is Janet Sumner. I'm the Executive Director at Wildlands League. And this is a picture of me having a really great day at work. We're in Northeast Alberta on a tour of a forestry operation. We're in a helicopter. I think it was the helicopter had a clear floor, so when you're sitting there, you could literally see your feet dangling in the air as you're only 500 feet above the treetops. It was absolutely a gorgeous day, gorgeous fall day, and we were traveling with Alberta Pacific. So I'll tell you a little bit about Wildlands League, and thank you very much for joining us here at the virtual Green Living Show, and thank you to the Green Living Show for making this possible. Wildlands League came about in 1968. We're just over 50 years old. We looked like this back then. We were working on wolves and the science behind how to keep them and protect Algonquin and forestry. And this is what we look like today. This is Anna Baggio. She's our Director of Conservation. She's at a town hall meeting, I believe, in Timmins, probably speaking to the media about forestry, I believe. This is one of our annual events. We try to connect kids to nature. It's a paddling event that we do in Rouge National Urban Park, where we bring kids out and we teach them how to paddle. This year, though, it's going to be delayed at least a year because of where we sit with the coronavirus. We work on climate change and we work on the protection of species. And those two things are actually linked. A warming climate can exacerbate stresses on ecosystems and on animals and actually drive extinction. Species that are being lost, they're being lost because they're losing their habitat, and that habitat, if it happens to be a really carbon-rich, dense habitat, will potentially help exacerbate or drive climate change and accelerate it. But what's also interesting is that the two are linked in terms of solutions. The more habitat that we protect that's carbon-rich, it actually will suck in, if you will, more carbon, and it will keep more stored. And the better we do on climate change, the less stress there is on ecosystems and on animals. So those two global challenges, the most significant environmental challenges of our time, species loss and climate change, are linked, both in how they can help drive each other in bad ways, and also how the solutions can actually help to solve each of them. We will go to almost any lengths to find a solution. And this is a picture from a day when we were working on climate change. What you see there is the boreal peatlands. They stretch all the way, boreal James Bay, Hudson Bay, James Bay complex. It goes all the way from Manitoba through Ontario and then into Quebec. It is a rich, dense, slowly decomposing, cold, organic stew of matter. And it has been said to be anywhere from 6 to 12 meters deep. I don't even think they have it fully mapped to know, which means we don't know truly how much carbon is there. All we know is it's billions of tons of carbon in there. And our job is to figure out, how do we keep it there? How do we protect it? How do we not see it becoming so explored or developed that we're releasing all that carbon and exacerbating climate change? We get to go to some of the coolest places on the planet. And sometimes we're flying over forestry units, and this is where we start to think it's not about whether you do or you don't do forestry, but it's how, it's where, it's how much. And for us, we get a chance to work with some great companies who want to show us how they do things, and then we can work on solutions together. But one of the things that had been bothering us for the last number of years, and in particular had been bothering Trevor, my director of policy and research, was we were being told that for every tree that was cut, 100% was coming back, that every tree that was cut, we replanted it and they all came back. The only problem was that wasn't what we were seeing. We were seeing this strange pattern in the forest, and so Trevor decided to go out and investigate it. And he did a study in Northwest Ontario. You can see it on a website called loggingscars.ca. And he looked at 27 different units, and we found this pattern in each of those units. And on average, about 14% of the forest was not coming back. Now, this is, we looked at forests that were as old as 30 years old, some that were as new as 10 years since they'd been cut. But on average, 14% was not going to come back. And I had this strange pattern where you'd almost see the linear lines that had been the roads that were access roads before. And it had these, what are called landings, where they would, when they cut the trees, they'd drag them to the roadside and stack them up. And I think on some of that, you can actually see the little brown trees that are sort of stacked one on top of each other. And sometimes those are like a meter high, sometimes like 10, 12 feet high, and it's smothering the ground, and it won't actually allow the trees to come back through it. I mean, maybe they will, but certainly in a rotation, when you're going back to cut it in maybe 80 years, at 30 years, if it's still not there, you're not going to get full-grown trees by the time you go to harvest it again. So about 14% isn't coming back, which represents a deforestation loss there, and also a loss of carbon. We think in big, large scales. We think in watersheds because we need to. If we're going to actually work on making sure that the planet is healthy for us, for species, we need to be thinking in broad landscape level scale. So what that means in Northern Ontario, for example, is we think about these watersheds, which are the last 5 great rivers in North America that are unregulated. They're still undammed and free-flowing, and they're in Ontario. And that's the Albany, the Attawapiskat watershed, the Ekwan, the Winnisk, and the Severn. And of these, I believe the watersheds that will intersect with the Ring of Fire, the Albany is sort of the southern portion, the northern portion of the Albany, but the Ring of Fire is a development that Ontario wants to move forward with, and it's a mining development, chromite, nickel, and other materials up there. And if this were to go forward, it would have impacts on the Albany, the Attawapiskat, the Ekwan for sure, and I believe also the Winnisk potentially, and maybe even the Severn, depending on what the configuration looks like. So it's really incumbent upon us to think in watershed scales and be thinking like that. So, and trying to answer some of the questions before we go ahead with development. This is an area that we visited. It's just on the northern portion there of the watershed that's on the southern portion of the Ring of Fire. You can see that sort of looks like a ring, or at least a crescent, and it's kind of got a bunch of black. That's the mining claims, and the picture is of a development camp or an exploration camp, and they're trying to map what does the mineral find look like underneath us. To do that, they have to put drills and drill a core down into the ground, and then they pull it up and they measure how much of each metal is at what depth. And where you see the sort of round circles on the image here, those are where you had a drill pad. So they would drill down there, and then they would have to move the machinery along to the next drill site, and that's what creates those kind of like a groove into the boreal bog system. So when we were up there, we were actually given a warning by the man who was giving us a tour of it. I think he was the camp supervisor or coordinator, and he explained to us that this boreal bog system is a very, very soft stew, and cautioned us and said, you can't step off on either side just to how soft it is. And he gave us an example. So they had these pallets laid down. It was kind of like a little footbridge that got us from where we landed on the helicopter to actually get us into the camp. And when he stood off of that, he sunk down almost up to his pelvis very quickly, just to make an impression upon us that we should not step off into the boreal bog system. So that's why you get these grooves. And what they do is that groove then changes the hydrology, how the water moves. And that water will potentially create impacts in terms of, you've got mercury sitting there in these soils, and it could methylate the mercury, mobilize it. How much of that will move up through the food chain would be some of the questions we would have. We would have questions about when you actually change the hydrology and you create this groove into the boreal bog system, are you releasing either methane or just expediting the release of carbon from this very dense, rich carbon area? And so those would be some of the kinds of questions we would want to see answered before we move forward with certainty on a development. And that's the kind of work that we do, is to start asking the questions and see if we can develop the answers. We routinely work with First Nations when invited. We believe in working in an ethical way with First Nations. In other words, we understand that First Nations are their own governments, and Indigenous nations are their own governments, and that we should work with them in a way that is about thinking about how the two knowledge systems, the two cultural systems, can talk to each other, have what's called two-eyed seeing, being able to see each other and work together. And for us as a nonprofit environmental group, seeing those governments as governments that we have to speak to and treat with respect and work with in a way that acknowledges them as the decision makers on their land. Sometimes we sleep with polar bears. Well, not quite. We were going, I believe this is, we were going up the Sumner River, and as we were traversing the Sumner River, Dave saw this groove in the side of the hill, and he explained to me that, as Dave, he's my forest manager, he explained to me that that was in fact a place where very likely a polar bear had gone and carved out a space to nest in and have a snooze. And so Dave went to try it out as a nap place. Dave likes his naps, and so that was for him a nice cozy little hidey hole, and it gives you sort of a sense of the size. Sometimes it is not always a great idea when the wildlife comes to greet you. We were just about to land on this area, and we were just over that ridge. We were going to be camping for about 4 nights when this guy came out to greet us. And when you're not the top of the food chain, it's a little disturbing to see a polar bear come out to greet you, but he was a magnificent creature, and it was great to meet him. We are experts in protecting the natural world. And currently, we believe that everybody is bearing witness, if you will. We are all have a front row seat, and we're all in this together in terms of climate change and the extinction crisis, and how we develop solutions to that is really going to predict how life exists on this planet. So what's also interesting is Canada's role. I've always found it fascinating that Canada has various roles to play on different issues across the world, but in nature and in climate change, quite frankly, we have a very, very important role. As you can see here, this is a picture of North America and a little bit of Central America, and the ecosystems are not defined by political boundaries. They are drawn by nature. And how Canada behaves is actually going to have not only local impacts, whether it's the temperate rainforests of BC or the grasslands in Saskatchewan or the Carolinian forest in Ontario or the boreal. All of that is going to be those are sort of local or very specific ecosystem impacts. But what's also very interesting about Canada is we have 24% of the world's wetlands, 33% of the world's boreal, 20% of the global freshwater, 25% of the temperate forest, and 1/3 of the land-based carbon storage. 1/3 of the land-based carbon storage is in Canada. That's a massive trust we have. It's on a global scale. We also have these mammal movement corridors. They go from the Yellowstone up to the Yukon, and from Algonquin down to the Adirondacks and up through the Appalachians. We have to take care of those, and our actions will predict what happens and how well they do and how well they serve mammal movement on the continent. With the Northwest Passage. What's also interesting, and this is a fun story where I bring this together, is that the boreal, which is made up of a forested boreal, which is conifer, trees, conifer dominant, and that really peaty, boggy area. But the boreal goes all the way from Alaska, and it goes down here and across like this. And that boreal system, you remember that picture of the guy with the bug jacket on and all those bugs? Well, that boreal system is a bug paradise. It breeds bugs. So guess what happens? 40% of the hemisphere's birds, they travel north to nest in the boreal because they have a ready food source. All those bugs. It's bug paradise. 3 billion birds travel north to the boreal each year, and 5 billion then replenish the hemisphere. So on a global scale, we have a trust in how much carbon we have. Hemispherically, we've got 40% of the hemisphere's birds nesting up in the boreal. We've really got to think about the actions that we take as a country, both for climate and for nature. Because what we do here is going to have all of those impacts. We have a huge responsibility. Our responsibility is to, will we actually be able to coexist with nature? Can we actually figure that out? Can we figure out how we develop? How much, where, and how intensely? Can we make room for nature? Will we be able to fall in love with nature? Appreciate it, and leave enough of it so that ecosystems actually flourish. The science is saying we need somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% for nature. Right now, the world has only promised to protect 17%, and the federal government has promised to do 25% by 2025, but really what the science is suggesting is maybe 50% is needed. Will we be able to develop deep connections to nature? Will we teach our children in our lives how to connect to nature? Will we get a love affair with nature? And we will take our responsibilities and how we develop seriously and make sure that we have as much knowledge as we step into these ecosystems so that we can once again live in harmony with nature. Will we get bowled over by the absolute sheer wonder of nature? These are the kinds of questions that at Wildlands League we're trying to answer so that we can meet the dual challenges of climate change and loss of species. For us, these are big questions, and Canada has an enormous role to play in this. And we invite you to help us with our work. Take a look at our Instagram page, our Facebook, and on our website. You can find out more about the work that we do at Wildlands League. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank the Green Living Show and for Eugenia who's our outreach manager, making all of today a really fun experiment for us as we took a look at doing a virtual takeover of the Green Living page. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.